In tonight's episode, we have 3 chilling tales from across Asia, each one rooted in a tradition so strange it will blur the line between folklore and nightmare. The first takes us deep into rural China, where an ancient custom has survived for centuries, twisting into something far darker. It's called Minghun, the ghost marriage, and it begins not with love, but with death. Villagers say the spirits of the unmarried dead wander restlessly, desperate for a partner, and that without one, they bring misfortune to the living. But in recent years, this ritual has taken a disturbing turn, one that no one dares speak about after dark. What happens when a family decides the only way to appease a spirit is to marry it? Let's step into the shadow of the ceremony. The story begins in a remote farming village, miles from the nearest city, where the mist rolls over the fields like a shroud each morning. Our main character, a young schoolteacher named Li Wei, had traveled here to visit his late uncle's family. It was meant to be a short stay, a respectful visit to pay his condolences after the old man's sudden passing. But from the moment he stepped off the rickety bus, he noticed the way the villagers watched him. Not with suspicion, but with a strange, almost expectant curiosity. The home where he stayed was old, its wooden beams blackened with age. Inside, the air was thick with incense, though no one seemed to be burning any. His aunt greeted him warmly, but her eyes lingered on him just a little too long, as if measuring something she didn't dare say out loud. That night, over dinner, the conversation never once mentioned his uncle's death. Instead, his relatives spoke in hushed tones about arrangements and preparations. They asked Li Wei about his health, his age, even his birth date. He laughed it off, thinking it was small talk, but the mood was wrong. There was a tension in the air, the kind that hums quietly before a storm. It wasn't until he noticed the corner of the living room that his unease deepened. Draped in red silk, there stood what looked like a wedding altar. Candles, bowls of fruit. A porcelain doll dressed in a crimson bridal gown. Its face, pale and expressionless, seemed to be turned ever so slightly toward him. When he asked who it was for, the table fell silent. Only his aunt spoke, her voice calm, but her eyes heavy. "It's for family," she said, "and soon it will be for you." The next morning, Li Wei woke to the sound of muffled voices outside his door. The old wooden panels let the whispers bleed through, just enough for him to catch fragments. His name, the word bride, and something about a match. When he slid the door open, the hallway was empty, though the faint scent of burning paper lingered in the air. At breakfast, his aunt was nowhere to be found. Instead, an elderly man he had never seen before sat at the table, sipping tea. His face was deeply lined, his eyes sharp despite his frail frame. He introduced himself as Master Zhang, but offered no further explanation. He simply studied Li Wei in silence, nodding occasionally as though confirming some unspoken decision. When Li Wei tried to ask about his uncle, Master Zhang waved a hand dismissively and changed the subject to dates and times, mentioning that tonight would be favorable. The conversation felt like a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and no matter how Li Wei tried to steer it toward clarity, it always curved back into strange, ritualistic language. Later, while exploring the courtyard, Li Wei noticed several young men carrying bundles wrapped in red cloth toward the house. When one of the bundles shifted unnaturally, he froze. A pale, delicate hand slipped from beneath the cloth before being hastily tucked back in. The men didn't speak to him, didn't even meet his eyes, but their pace quickened as they disappeared into the storage room. That night, his aunt finally returned, her expression lighter than before, almost relieved. She handed him a folded set of crimson robes and told him to wear them in the morning. When he asked why, she smiled faintly. "Your uncle was alone in the afterlife," she said. "We cannot let you meet the same fate." Her words made no sense. He was alive, healthy, standing right in front of her, but the way she said it, as if his fate had already been sealed, sent a shiver down his spine. Somewhere deep inside, he realized this visit was no longer about honoring the dead. It was about binding him to something he didn't understand and maybe couldn't escape. That evening, the village seemed to close in around him. The air grew heavy, and the usual hum of crickets was replaced by an eerie, unnatural stillness. Li Wei decided to clear his head with a walk, but as he moved through the narrow dirt paths, he noticed that people were watching him from behind half-shut doors. A few whispered prayers as he passed, their eyes darting nervously toward the red robes folded under his arm. When he reached the small convenience shop near the edge of the village, the shopkeeper, a middle-aged woman with streaks of grey in her hair, froze at the sight of him. She glanced over her shoulder, then leaned across the counter. Her voice was low, almost trembling. "Leave before morning," she whispered. "They've chosen you. Leave before morning. 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 Leave." Before he could ask what she meant, an older man stepped into the shop, one of the villagers who had carried the red bundles earlier. His face was expressionless, but his presence silenced the shopkeeper immediately. He handed Li Wei a small bag of rice, claiming it was a gift from his aunt, and motioned for him to follow. Back at the house, the strange preparations had intensified. The porcelain doll on the altar now wore a delicate gold headpiece, and incense smoke curled upward in thick, suffocating waves. Master Zhang was there again, chanting under his breath while sprinkling wine onto the floor in a deliberate pattern. Li Wei's unease deepened when he caught sight of the storage room door, now sealed shut with strips of yellow talisman paper marked in black ink. His aunt caught him staring and quickly ushered him away, insisting he rest for the big day. That night, he lay awake, the air stifling. Just past midnight, he heard the faint scrape of the storage door opening. Then came the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps, bare feet, dragging slightly across the wooden floor. They stopped just outside his room. He held his breath, his pulse hammering in his ears. The silence stretched until a soft, unfamiliar voice whispered through the door. "Don't wear the red." It was gone before he could respond, leaving him with nothing but the lingering scent of earth and decay. Morning came shrouded in thick fog, the kind that swallowed the village whole. Li Wei barely slept, the warning from the night before gnawing at his thoughts. When his aunt entered his room, she carried the crimson robes and laid them gently on the bed, her expression unreadable. "It's time," she said. He tried to refuse, insisting he didn't understand what any of this was about. But Master Zhang appeared in the doorway, flanked by two silent men. Without a word, they began lighting long sticks of incense, the smoke curling in frantic swirls as if stirred by some invisible force. Li Wei was led to the courtyard, where a full wedding altar had been prepared. The porcelain doll now sat upright, hands clasped around a small bouquet of wilted chrysanthemums. But it was what sat beside the doll that made his stomach twist. A coffin, draped in red silk, its lid partially open. Inside, he saw a pale face framed by black hair, lips painted a deep, unnatural crimson. He stumbled back, his breath catching. "Who is she?" No one answered. Instead, the villagers began the ceremony. Drums pounded, firecrackers exploded, and paper money burned in iron basins. Every sound and smell seemed amplified, suffocating him. As the chanting grew louder, Master Zhang took his hand and placed it over the cold, unmoving fingers of the woman in the coffin. Li Wei felt a jolt of icy numbness race up his arm, locking his knees in place. "She will not wander anymore," Master Zhang said, his voice almost reverent. "And neither will you." In that moment, Li Wei realized this was no symbolic ritual. This was a binding, and he was no guest here. He was part of the offering. The ceremony halted abruptly when the old shopkeeper pushed her way through the gathered crowd. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes blazing with urgency. She spoke in rapid, clipped words, her gaze fixed on Li Wei. "They haven't told you the truth," she said. "This is Minghun, a ghost marriage." Murmurs rippled through the villagers, but no one stopped her. She stepped closer, ignoring Master Zhang's glare. "Your uncle died without a wife. They believe his spirit wanders restlessly, bringing misfortune to the family. They've chosen you to marry this woman, dead for months, so her spirit will join him in the afterlife. It will tie you to her forever." Li Wei's mind reeled. The strange questions about his birth date, the way his aunt avoided speaking of his uncle's death, the sealed storage room, the voice in the night telling him not to wear red. It all snapped into place with a sickening clarity. He looked again at the coffin. The woman's skin was waxy, her body dressed in layers of fine silk. Around her neck hung a jade pendant, glinting in the light, an heirloom meant to travel with her to the other side. Master Zhang's voice cut through his thoughts. "The union is a blessing. You will carry her spirit. She will keep you safe." Safe. The word rang hollow. This wasn't about protection. It was about trapping him in a fate he had never chosen. The incense, the offerings, the locked doors, They weren't for the dead bride, they were for him. To keep him here, to make sure he couldn't leave until the vows were spoken and sealed in the only way this ritual knew. Somewhere beyond the crowd, a drum sounded again, slow and steady, like a heartbeat counting down. The shopkeeper grabbed Li Wei's arm, pulling him toward the gate, but the crowd closed in, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. Master Zhang's chanting rose to a fever pitch, the air thick with smoke and the sharp crack of firecrackers. Li Wei wrenched free, shoving past the altar, past the coffin, only to feel something cold wrap around his wrist. He looked down. The dead bride's fingers were gripping him. Her eyes, once closed, were half open now, glazed yet fixed directly on his. A faint smile tugged at her lips as the drums thundered. He tore himself free and ran, the villagers' shouts echoing behind him. He didn't stop until he reached the road, lungs burning, heart pounding. When he finally dared to look back, the fog had swallowed the village whole. But on his wrist, where her fingers had been, was a deep red mark, shaped perfectly like a ring. The tale of Minghun may seem like a relic of China's distant past, but it is far from the only tradition meant to bind the living to the dead. Across the waters in Taiwan, a similar belief lingers, a fear of wandering souls who die without a spouse, unable to find rest. Here, the rituals take on a gentler appearance, draped in the language of compassion, yet rooted in the same unshakable dread. They call it the spirit bride rite. Sometimes the groom is another spirit. Sometimes he's alive. And while the ceremonies may look like celebrations, those who've been part of them whisper of strange dreams, unexplained sickness, and blessings that come at a price. Our next story takes us inside one such marriage and the unsettling aftermath. The story begins in a small fishing town on Taiwan's western coast, a place where the sea mist drifts through the streets at dawn and the locals speak of the dead as if they are still part of the community. Our main character, Jian Hao, had returned here after years in the city to attend his cousin's funeral. She had died suddenly at just 23, unmarried, with her whole life ahead of her. The wake was held in her family home, a modest two-story building with weathered red lanterns swaying in the salty wind. Inside, the air was thick with incense, its sweet smoke curling toward a wooden altar where her portrait rested. Her expression in the photo was warm, almost alive, which made the silence of the room feel heavier. Jian Hao had come only to pay his respects, to kneel before the altar, and to offer paper money for her journey to the next world. But from the moment he stepped inside, he felt eyes on him, watchful, assessing. His aunt greeted him with uncharacteristic warmth, her hands lingering on his shoulders a moment too long. That night, over bowls of steaming fish soup, the conversation shifted from grief to arrangements. They spoke of a rite that would ensure his cousin's spirit would not wander. They spoke of his age, his health, his unmarried status. The way they avoided looking directly at him made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He laughed nervously, thinking it was just superstition. But in the dim glow of the altar candles, he noticed something unsettling. Beside his cousin's photo, a second framed space sat empty, waiting, as if for another face. The following morning, Jian Hao awoke to the faint sound of chanting drifting through the wooden walls. It wasn't the rhythmic prayers from the wake, it was slower, heavier, and carried an almost pleading tone. Curious, he followed the sound to the courtyard, but when he slid the door open, the chanting stopped. Only his aunt was there, scattering small piles of rice across the ground in neat, deliberate lines. She looked startled to see him, then quickly smiled. 4 blessings, she said, brushing the rice from her hands. But Jian Hao noticed something odd. Each pile formed a path leading from the altar room to the back of the house. Later that afternoon, he wandered to the small temple near the harbor. The elderly caretaker greeted him warmly, but when Jian Hao mentioned his cousin's name, the man's expression shifted. He asked if she had been married before she died. When Jian Hao said no, the caretaker grew quiet, his eyes flicking toward the temple's inner sanctum. "You should be careful tonight," the old man said at last. "Some spirits do not like to be left alone." That evening, the house was unusually busy. Neighbors arrived carrying red silk cloths, bundles of joss paper, and small gold ornaments. In the living room, his cousin's portrait had been moved to the center of a low table draped in crimson. Next to it was a bridal headdress, its gold pins glinting in the candlelight. Jian Hao's aunt approached him, holding a folded white handkerchief. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "you will help her find her place." When he asked what she meant, she only pressed the handkerchief into his hand. Embroidered on one corner, in delicate red thread, was a date. It was tomorrow's date. The air in the room felt suddenly heavier. Outside, the sea breeze rattled the wooden shutters, and in the flicker of the altar candles, Jian Hao could have sworn his cousin's smiling portrait shifted, just slightly, to face him. That night, the wind carried the scent of the sea through the open windows, but it couldn't mask the heavier smell of incense that seemed to saturate the air. Jian Hao lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when he heard a soft tapping at his door, 3 slow knocks. He called out, but there was no reply. Sliding the door open, he found the hallway empty, except for a trail of fresh red petals scattered across the wooden floor, leading toward the altar room. He followed cautiously, the petals sticking slightly to his bare feet. Inside, the room was dim except for the glow of a single candle. His cousin's portrait sat in its usual place, but now a second frame had been added beside it. The glass was empty, reflecting his own uneasy face. Before he could move, a sharp voice cut through the stillness. It was his uncle, stepping into the room with a glare. "You shouldn't be here," he said firmly, closing the distance between them. "The rites are for the living and the dead, not the curious." His tone left no room for argument, but there was something in his eyes, fear, not anger. Later, when the house had grown quiet again, Jian Hao returned to his room and found a folded note tucked under his pillow. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. "Don't drink the tea. No signature, no explanation." The next morning, his aunt served him breakfast, a steaming bowl of rice and a small porcelain cup of dark tea. She watched closely as he lifted the cup, her smile frozen, unblinking. He set it down untouched, muttering something about not being thirsty. Her expression didn't change, but her hand tightened ever so slightly around the edge of the table. From outside, the sound of drums began, slow, deliberate beats that seemed to echo through his chest. The neighbors were gathering again, their voices low, their eyes flicking toward him in the same way they had on his first day back. And through the open window, he saw a figure in the courtyard, draped in red, standing perfectly still, watching. By midday, the drums had grown louder, joined by the sharp crackle of firecrackers outside. Jian Hao's aunt appeared at his doorway, holding a folded red robe. "It's time," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made his stomach tighten. He followed her to the courtyard, where neighbors stood in a semicircle around a low altar. His cousin's portrait had been moved to the center, surrounded by offerings of fruit, wine, and stacks of joss paper. But what caught his attention was the figure in red he'd seen earlier, now standing beside the altar. At first, he thought it was a mannequin dressed for the ceremony. Then it moved. The long sleeves shifted with a slow, deliberate grace, and a pale hand emerged from the folds of silk. Its nails were painted a deep, glossy red, the color of fresh blood. Master Liang, the temple priest, stepped forward, his voice rising above the drums. "Today, we bring peace to the wandering soul. Today, she will have her place." Jian Hao tried to step back, but 2 men moved behind him, blocking the way. The priest took his hand and pressed it against the sleeve of the figure in red. The fabric was ice cold, and beneath it, there was weight. A body. In that instant, the figure's head tilted, just enough for him to glimpse a face beneath the veil, pale skin, lips tinted crimson, and eyes half open, glassy yet somehow aware. A shiver crawled up his spine as the drums quickened. Master Liang smiled faintly. "The living will guide the dead, and the dead will bless the living." Jian Hao's pulse pounded in his ears. This was no symbolic ritual. Whatever stood beside him wasn't just part of the ceremony, it was part of him now. The chanting slowed, and Master Liang's voice took on a solemn, almost intimate tone. "Your cousin could not pass on alone," he said, eyes fixed on Jian Hao. "A woman without a husband has no place in the afterlife. Her spirit wanders, restless, hungry." Jian Hao's aunt stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly before her. "We did not tell you sooner," she began, "because you would have refused. But this is for your protection, and for hers. The bond must be made with blood, with breath, with life." He glanced at the figure in red. Now, from beneath the veil, he could see more clearly, the same gold pins from the altar, the same jade pendant she had worn in life. This was his cousin, her body dressed as a bride, her spirit waiting for the vows to bind her to him. The scattered rice in the courtyard, the date stitched into the handkerchief, the note telling him not to drink the tea, it all made sickening sense now. They hadn't been preparing him for a funeral, they'd been preparing him for a wedding. Master Liang lifted a small dish of wine, dipping a thin brush into the liquid. He began to trace symbols on Jian Hao's palm, each stroke sending a cold sting into his skin. Once the rites are complete, the priest said, her spirit will enter your home, your body, your dreams. She will keep you from harm, and you will keep her from loneliness. The drums resumed, slow and deliberate, like the steady beat of a closing door. Jian Hao's gaze locked on the figure beside him, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw her lips move, forming his name. The drums built to a deafening roar as the final chant began. Jian Hao's pulse raced, every instinct told him to run. He jerked his hand from Master Liang's grip and shoved past the men behind him, sending offerings clattering to the ground. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he sprinted toward the gate. He didn't look back until he reached the empty street outside. The sea wind hit him like a wave, sharp and cold, clearing the incense from his lungs. For a moment it felt like he had escaped. Then he heard it. Soft footsteps on the stone path behind him. Slow, unhurried. Turning, he saw no one. Only a length of red silk fluttering in the wind, snagged on the gate he had just passed through. When he reached for it, the fabric slid into his palm on its own, warm, as if someone had just been wearing it. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you liked them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day.